Only believe, all things are possible.
Supernatural, the life of William Branham. This is the most phenomenal true story you will ever read. It will change the way you think about the world you live in and the world beyond. Chapter 1, Mysterious Birth Sign, covering the years 1909 to 1912. 15 is not too young to have a baby, muttered Ella Branham to herself, trying to bolster her courage. Why, I'm just as ready as... The pain struck again, stronger, more commanding than before. Ella felt her panic rise with a spreading discomfort. She held her swollen stomach and groaned. Not yet. Please, not yet. Not until Charles comes home. Beads of sweat popped out on her forehead. She staggered across the dirt floor to the cabin's only window, set in the middle of a crude wooden door. The window had no glass, only a wooden shutter which Ella left open during the day and closed at night. Now it was open. "Charles!" she screamed. Her voice seemed to evaporate into the Kentucky backwoods, with its vast expanse of hills and hollows stretching out from her in every direction. Knowing her nearest neighbor lived miles away made Ella feel desperately alone. The pain tightened around her stomach, driving her into a panic. "Charles!" she screamed. Again, "Charles, where are you?" Then her voice sank into a feeble sob. "Please come home. I need you." Charles Branham had received his logging pay that morning and had walked into Burkesville, Kentucky to buy a new pair of bib overalls. "In honor of my first child," he said. But what was keeping him so long? Had he gotten waylaid by a tavern? If so, it would not have been the first time in their one-year marriage, but surely Charles wouldn't do such a thing today. He knew their baby was due any time. The contraction subsided, leaving her spent. Ella sagged against the splintery door jamb, watching the sun settle behind the maples and oaks that had just begun to bud. It was April in the year 1909. Ella shivered as she closed the shutter. Now the only light in the cabin came from the sunset filtering through the chinks between the roughly squared logs. Pencil beams of light moved slowly across the table, a homemade affair, built from a sawed-off tree stump with wooden pegs for legs and a bench for a seat. The only other piece of furniture in the single 12-foot-long room was a primitive bed nailed to one wall. Ella staggered to the bed and collapsed on its straw tick, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The corn-shuck pillow crackled under her head with every move. As the room darkened to black, Ella thought about her former home in Paris, Texas, which she had so recently wanted to escape. Last year it had seemed intolerable, but now, from this position, it did not seem so bad. She had grown up in Texas as Ella Harvey. Her father was a hunter, trapper, and schoolteacher. Her mother was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. Ella, the oldest of 4 children, had lived a wonderful, carefree childhood until 3 years ago when her mother died from scarlet fever. At that time, Ella was barely 12 years old, and her youngest brother was only 4. The chore of mothering fell heavily into Ella's lap. A little over a year ago, she'd met Charles Branham at a rodeo. Charles was short and handsome, with curly black hair, broad shoulders, and enough cowboy skills to defeat almost every bucking bronco that he challenged. Ella was smitten by his charm. Charles was 18 and she was 14, but she felt years older. At that time, marriage had seemed like a good way to avoid the drudgery of caring for her younger siblings. Now she wondered if she had merely jumped from one hot frying pan into another. Here she was, 15 years old, a stranger in the Kentucky hills, having a baby 40 miles from the nearest doctor, with not even a friend to call on for help. Burying her head in her pillow, Ella wept. Charles Branham returned to the cabin an hour after dark. He had been drinking, of course, but not enough to dull his thinking. He inched the door open quietly so that he wouldn't disturb his young wife if she were asleep. Then he heard her moan. Charles quickly lit a pine knot and set it on the lid of a fruit jar. The pine knot burned with a dim, sputtering light that gave off volumes of smoke. Because the cabin was naturally ventilated, the smoke drifted up past the rafters, sifting out through the cracks in the clapboard shingles overhead. "Charles," Ella whispered weakly, "tonight's the night. Go fetch your mama." Charles built a fire, then he hurried to his mother's cabin. The night was cold and clear, and the starlight made it easy to keep on the path. An hour later he returned with his mother and 2 neighbor women. Grandma Branham was a crusty old woman, tough as bacon rind, but seeing this little 15-year-old girl in labor softened her like hot coon grease softens boot leather. Not that Grandma Branham ever used boots herself. She'd never owned a pair of shoes in her life. Now she took charge of the situation. Having had 17 children of her own, she was well prepared to act as midwife for her new daughter-in-law. She insisted that Charles wait outside. He did not argue. Taking a blanket, he crawled under the lean-to tacked onto one end of the cabin, making his bed on the wood chips and bark. Pulling a flask of whiskey out of his pocket, Charles polished it off to calm his nerves. Before long, he fell sound asleep. As dawn approached, the commotion inside the cabin grew more intense. Charles roused. The eastern horizon was turning lighter with the approach of dawn, but the sun had not yet risen. He cursed himself for having dozed, and then started to worry because his baby had not yet been born. Was something wrong? Maybe he should go inside and check. Before he could make up his mind, he heard the high-pitched squall of a newborn. The cabin door flew open, and one of the neighbor women called, "Charles Branham, it's a boy." Sheepishly, Charles shuffled inside and closed the door. The room smelled of smoke from a greased candle on the table. Grandma Branham finished washing the infant, weighed him at 5 pounds, then gently laid him in his mother's arms. Charles stood near the bed with his hands tucked into the bib of his new overalls, nervously watching this wiggling, grunting little creature that was his son. Ella said, "Charles, he's got your blue eyes." Charles studied the small eyes, but in the dim light he couldn't tell their color. "We'll call his first name William," he said, "and his middle name will be Marion." Ella tested the name with her tongue. William Merriam Branham. It sounded distinguished enough, and he can go by the name of Billy. "Charles, I think Billy's going to have your curly hair, too. Open the shutter so I can see him better." It was shortly after 5 o'clock, Tuesday morning, April 6, 1909. Daylight filtered in through the chinks, even though the sun had not yet topped the horizon. Charles opened the shutter, then drew back, startled. Something had darted through the open window. A light, like a star, about a foot in diameter. Ella screamed and cradled her son tightly to her bosom. The others, bewildered, stepped back against the wall. The strange light circled the room several times, then stopped over the bed, hovering above the new mother and the child, glowing yellowish green, pulsating with a life of its own. For less than a minute it held that position. Not long, yet long enough for everyone in the cabin to be sure they had really seen it. Then as quickly as it had come in, the fireball left, whirling up past the rafters and out through the roof. Charles stared up at the clapboard shingles with wide, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, a flurry of wings turned his attention towards the door, where a dove had landed on the sill of the open window. The snow-white dove eyed the room with curiosity, almost as if looking for something. When it spotted the newborn baby, it cocked its head and cooed before it flew away. Charles gazed after the bird for a moment, then rolled his eyes back up towards the roof. One of the neighbor women muttered, "Well, I never." The other mused, "I wonder what kind of young'un this boy will be." Billy Branham was only 15 minutes old. News spread quickly among the mountain folk about that young'un born yonder on the hill with a light over him. Some passed it off as sunlight reflecting from a mirror. Ella and Charles knew better, since there were no mirrors in their cabin. Besides, the sun had not yet come up. They were puzzled. Was there some spiritual meaning in the light? Charles wanted to forget it, but Ella wouldn't let him. She insisted that something must be done, and finally decided that their baby should be taken to a church and dedicated to God. At first Charles argued against this idea, but finally he consented, although the concession raked against the grain of his character. Now the question came up, where should they take him? The ancestry of Charles Branham was strictly Irish Catholic. On Ella's side, the Harveys were Irish Catholic too, except for Ella's mother, who belonged to the Cherokee Nation. However, both Charles and Ella had drifted completely away from their Catholic foundation, and neither of them had any formal religious convictions. They agreed that for their purpose, the best church was the nearest church. So, when Billy Branham was 2 weeks old, Charles and Ella bundled him up and took him down to the Opossum Kingdom Baptist Church, where a small congregation met each Sunday in a rustic log building with a dirt floor and pews made from boards lying across upturned blocks of wood. The Opossum Kingdom Baptist Church had no regular pastor. On most Sundays, the congregation sang songs and read from the Bible. But every 2 months, a circuit preacher came through and delivered a sermon. The old preacher was there today. He offered prayer over little William Merriam Branham, asking God to someday use this boy in his service. It was the last time Billy Branham would enter a church building for 23 years. Logging often forced Charles to be away from his wife and son during the week. That October in 1909, a blizzard stranded him in a lumber camp far from home. Ella, 4 months pregnant with their second child, worried as her supplies dwindled. When her firewood ran out, she wrapped her feet in burlap bags and struggled through the waist-high drifts and biting wind, fighting her way into the woods to chop down saplings and dead branches, dragging them back into the cabin in a desperate attempt to keep her fire going. But when her food gave out, she despaired. The fire cooled to ashes. Ella was too weak to make another trip outside for wood. Gathering every scrap of clothing in the cabin, she wrapped herself and her son as best she could, crawled into bed, and pulled the quilt over them. Outside, the wind howled unceasingly. The room chilled until her water bucket froze. Ella stared up into the rafters and considered again that strange light at her son's birth. She had thought of it often over the past 6 months. Sometimes she believed it was a sign that Billy was destined for greatness. Now it seemed meaningless, since death for both of them could not be far away. Her nearest neighbor was an old man who lived across the valley. When the storm blew out, this neighbor stepped outside to do some chores. He could just see the top of the Branham cabin, and he noticed there was no smoke rising from the chimney. At the time he didn't give it much thought, but after several days he grew concerned. He knew smoke had been coming from the cabin before the storm, and no one could have left the cabin during the storm. Figuring something might be wrong, he decided to investigate. As he approached the cabin, he saw there were no tracks in the new-fallen snow. That confirmed his fear that no one had left the cabin after the storm ended. He knocked, but got no reply. When he tried the door, he found it was locked from the inside. Now he knew someone was in there, someone who must be in serious trouble, or they would have answered him. With a great effort, he managed to force open the door. What he found inside made him shudder. Ella and her baby were huddled on the bed, almost dead from cold and starvation. Hurriedly, the neighbor grabbed Ella's axe and went into the woods, bringing back enough fuel to warm the cabin. Finding no food, he trudged home and returned with as many groceries as he could carry. Calling a doctor was out of the question, so the old man took care of the young mother and child himself. By the time Charles broke through the drifts to his cabin, his wife and son were starting to recover their strength. The rest of that winter, Charles stayed close to home, hunting and trapping to keep the larder filled. In the spring, he went back to logging. After the ice thawed, he would hitch up an ox to the logs and one by one drag them down to the Cumberland River, where other loggers would lash them together into a raft, float them down to the Ohio River, and then on to the Mississippi. In March of 1910, Charles and Ella had their second child, Edward. A few months later, Ella, now 16, felt another baby growing in her womb. She bore her third child early in 1911. It was another boy. She named him Henry. Charles logged through the spring and summer into the fall of 1911. Then misfortune struck again, ripping Charles from his young family and almost destroying him. As the youngest of 17 children, Charles Branham had grown up with many rough teachers. He learned to hold his whiskey when he was just a boy, and he learned to settle disputes with his fists. In the fall of 1911, Charles was at a party when a fight broke out. Moonshine and hardened men made a wicked mix, and soon the fight grew into a ferocious brawl involving everyone in the room. One powerful bully named Willie Yarborough knocked a friend of Charles to the floor, jumped on him and drew his knife, and was about to plunge it into his heart when Charles brought a chair down on Willie's head. Charles backed away and drew his own blade. Willie forgot the man on the floor and went after Charles. Willie would have slit Charles' throat if he had gotten the chance. He was a merciless man who had killed his own son with a fence rail, but Charles' knife found its mark first, leaving Willie in a pool of blood, senseless, though still alive. News of this brawl reached Burkesville, Kentucky. Charles was implicated as a ringleader and charged with attempted murder. A sheriff rode up on horseback to arrest him. Before the sheriff could find him, Charles caught wind of his danger. He had to leave in a hurry, not knowing where he would go or what he would do. Before he left, he promised Ella that as soon as he found work and a place for them to live, he would send for her, using an assumed name so he could not be traced. And so, in the space of an afternoon, Charles Branham vanished, leaving his wife alone in the woods to fend for herself and their 3 babies. Billy was 2.5, Edward was 1.5, and Henry was barely 6 months old. At 17, Ella was almost a child herself. Before a few weeks had passed, she realized Charles had left a part of himself with her. She was pregnant again. That fall and winter stretched Ella to the limit of her strength. She seemed to be living through a nightmare, trying to care for 3 babies in a rude, isolated cabin, while she herself felt nauseated much of the time. She had no money, no resources, and no energy. If it had not been for the help of Charles' relatives, poor as they were, Ella knew she would not have survived. But finally the seasons changed, the ground thawed, and her nausea ended. Henry passed his 1st birthday, Edward his 2nd, and Billy his 3rd. The baby kicking and twisting in Ella's womb was getting near delivery. Once during that spring of 1912, a sheriff stopped by the cabin to ask if Ella had heard from her husband. She could tell the truth. She had not heard from him and had no idea where he was. A few days after the sheriff's visit, Billy and Edward were playing outside the cabin where a small spring kept the ground muddy. Billy wanted to show his younger brother how strong he was, so he picked up the biggest rock he could lift, held it over his head, and threw it towards the spring. The rock sank deep into the muck by the water's edge, splattering mud all over Edward, who promptly cried and waddled back to the cabin. A robin began to chirp with gusto. Billy searched the branches until he spied the bird in a nearby tree. He took one step toward it, and the robin flew away. At that moment, something so startling happened that it would brand itself to his tender mind and become his first significant childhood memory. From where the robin had been perched, there came a sound like wind rustling the leaves. Whoosh! Then a voice boomed from the tree, a very clear human voice which said, "You will live near a city called New Albany." With a shriek of terror, Billy took off for the cabin as fast as his stubby legs could take him, squealing, "Mama! Mama!" Ella was wiping mud from Edward's tummy. "Billy, what happened?" she asked as she hugged her oldest son to her side. "A bird talked to me, Mama. I heard him singing in the tree. Then he talked to me." Ella laughed. "You were dreaming, child." "But Billy insisted. I heard him, Mama. I heard him talk." "And what did the bird say?" Ella teased, still thinking it was Billy's imagination. "He said we would live near a city called New Albany." This reply startled her. It did not seem like something a small boy would make up in his play. She stepped around behind the cabin and called into the woods, "Hello? Anybody there?" When she came back inside, Billy asked, "Mama, where is New Albany?" "It's a town in Indiana just across the river from Louisville, Kentucky, about 100 miles from here." "Billy, where did you hear talk of New Albany?" "I ain't never heard of New Albany, Mama, until that bird talked to me." "Mama, when are we going to live there? Will Papa live there with us?" Ella shook her head. Several weeks later, a long-awaited letter from Charles arrived. Ella sat at the stump table staring at the envelope she held between her trembling fingers. Billy stood on his tiptoes peeking over the tabletop. "Open it, Mama." Ella giggled nervously. "Of course. We've waited a long time for this. Why wait any longer? Carefully she undid the glued flap, removed the letter from its envelope, opened it, and began to read. Since her father was a school teacher, she had received a fair education, but Charles had almost no schooling and could neither read nor write, not even his own name. One of his brothers living in Louisville had written this letter for him. "What does it say, Mama?" Billy asked. She talked as she read. "It says that your papa is in Indiana. He's found steady work and a place for us to live, and he wants us to come right away. It's in a little town called Utica, about 10 miles northeast of—" She stopped abruptly and looked with amazement at her 3-year-old son. How could it be? "Where, Mama? Where is Utica?" Billy persisted. Ella said slowly, "Billy, we're going to live 10 miles northeast of New Albany, Indiana."